it will become more and more, and especially now that we see that Israel, which used to be this invincible fortress, Western fortress in the Middle East, is in fact not invisible, has become a weak point of the West in the Middle East, has become the problem. If we have today a conflict that develops around this issue with Palestine or with Lebanon or with Iran, this conflict would develop around Israel. And that would jeopardize other projects, investment projects promised by other countries and countries that are ready to cooperate with the West. So essentially, Israel has become a liability and no longer a benefit from the West. And I think Israel should think about this, because then that would probably help Israel to play more with its second pillar of the national security policy, instead of relying exclusively on the defense policy and an aggressive stance towards its neighbors. Probably I would suggest that for Israel it would be a good idea to elaborate on foreign policy and develop more better ties with its neighbors, try to solve problems related to the Palestinians and solve them intelligently based on the international law and not just based on gut feeling as they do now. And that would probably be the best guarantee for the survival of Israel. You cannot, as you said, it's unsustainable to have a security policy exclusively based on defense. And this, what Iran, and that's where I think Iran has, in fact, somehow won the conflict, to come back to your first question, because it demonstrated that Israel is not this country that has unlimited power. And if a country or its neighbors wanted to destroy it, it could be easily done. And I think that's the lesson we should, especially, we at large in the West, but also Israelis, should draw from this episode. It's a very unfortunate episode, which has cost a lot of lives for nothing, that has only contributed to degrade the perception of Israel in the world, which was not good, because as we had those exchange of missiles and as the world was focused on counting missiles on both parts, Israeli tanks shot at Palestinians who were waiting for food in Gaza. And apparently, according to Haaretz, they were ordered to do, meaning firing at children and women waiting for food was apparently an order given to them. No country can be respected after that. This is Israel behave, the way it behaves is a dishonor from the whole humanity. As a former military, I felt almost dishonored to see people with a uniform behaving like this. This is not the way a soldier behaves. And that's something that, of course, we are talking just about the last couple of days. But this has happened since, in fact, decades. That was a little bit more apparent after the 7th of October 2023. The Israelis are very much exemplify the problem. But we can see the same with other Western countries. This inability to consider that Iran, in that case, but you can apply that to China, to India, or to Russia, it's the same thing. These are countries that are highly educated, that have a huge tradition in resilience, in leadership, in knowledge management, not in the modern sense, but in the sense of using existing capabilities, especially academic capabilities and all that. And this inability to understand that the Iranians because they were the target of so many verbal and economic attacks in the past 30 years, that they prepared for that. And in 30 years, this is more than one generation in terms of human life, meaning that they had the time to create, not just to build weapons, but also to create this intellectual base, this industrial base, this engineering base, this all these aspects to build up a system of defense that we have seen in materialize in the resilience of the country. And the fact that the West is not able to understand that strikes me literally, because this was written, this was explicit, this was there, but we are blinded by our arrogance. And that's very true with the Israelis. And that will probably lead to their total defeat at one point, because when you're having, it's good to be self-confident, and we have to be self-confident. Therefore, here when we talk about Iran and the rest of the Middle East, we have a completely different, we should have a different way to see this country, but we don't, because most people don't know. Second aspect is that the picture we have of Iran today is largely the picture that was in fact created by the US after the 1979, after the collapse of the Shah regime and the government of the Ayatollah Khomeini and followers. And of course, the whole issue there is that the US was losing one of its main, let's say, strongholds in the Middle East, and therefore they had to demonize the Iranians, the Iran as a country and Iranians at large. And that's exactly what happens. With the support of independentist or separatist movements in the Kurds and the Baluch and the Wazi and others in the country, in order to destabilize the country. And that's the picture we have. Again, I have never lived in Iran. I don't know Iran more than what I can read, but I read not just in one direction, I read in all direction, and I try to have the most comprehensive picture of the society. We mentioned previously the Israelis, the US, and all that. And it's not a coincidence. The Israelis come from Europe. They don't have any cultural tie with the Middle East. Any. All these politicians that you have in Israel, in fact, have Polish, Hungarian, Russian, or Ukrainian name. I don't know now but in fact, they changed their name in order to look like Middle East people. But Netanyahu, this is not his real name. All these people like Ben Gvir and all that, they don't, Smotrich either. This is not their real name. It's an adjusted name because Netanyahu originates from Poland. So these people, they don't have the cultural background of the region. They come with a cultural background that comes from Central Europe. And that's the reason why they cannot understand this area where they claim they belong to since 2000 years. They have nothing in common with what you have in the region. And that, I think, is one of the factors that explains this inability to understand their adversary. It's also an inability to address, because when you don't know your enemy, you tend to have an aggressive stance instead of trying to talk to him. It's normal human behavior, probably. The problem is that when you are at the level of a state, that you don't play with your foreign policy tools in order to integrate yourself in the regional community. And one of my experience in the region is that is there something you can do always when the Middle East is talking about something before struggling and trying to fight. So there is a fundamental issue there that is very strangely, but not very surprisingly, the Israelis have never grasped this idea that the best, the best result you can achieve in terms of security is not to be the strongest and have the biggest army and all that. And in fact, we see that it's failing. The best way to achieve security is to have good relations with people, talk to them. And dialogue is, in fact, the best security. And it's very strange that we see exactly the same thing happening in Ukraine, by the way, that instead of trying to solve the problem by negotiation, as the Russians tried to promote and tried to implement with the Minsk Agreement and others, the Europeans are not so keen to talk. They fight. They provide new weapons. This is the EU foreign policy with Kaja Kallas has never managed to have any kind of influence on all these conflicts. Instead, the only way she took influence was to promise to provide weapons. That she is able to do. So there is a fundamental issue here that I think is worth mentioning. My understanding is that it's very hard to understand a culture when you are not part of it and when you have not, let's say, when you have not been in the country itself for the longer period of time, especially when it comes to those countries that have a very different culture, mentality, logic, you name it, than we do in the West. I have lived in other countries outside of Europe, especially in Africa, North Africa, and all that. So I'm aware of the fact that you cannot just look at the country from far away and make a judgment. Societies are much more flexible than we tend to portray them. They are more resilient. And even if we portray these countries, and that applies to Russia, to China, to Iran, and others, we want to portray them as dictatorships because it's convenient for us. It gives us the pretext to consider them as enemies because of our values, which should be defined, by the way. But anyway, but in reality, and that's something that I have said many times. I'm Swiss. France is just next door. But and both countries claim to be democracies. If with my Swiss eyes, I look at France, I see a monarchy, an electoral dictatorship, the monarchy, because the way the country is ruled is something that has nothing to do with what I know in Switzerland. But both countries define themselves as democracies. You had this kind of Western country surrounded by enemies of the West, enemies in a broader sense, because they were in some way related to either Soviet Union or the non-aligned movement, which for the US was considered as enemy because you are either with us or against us. And even Switzerland had a hard time to use its neutrality because the US tried many times to put Switzerland into the situation where they had to choose between the East and the West, and Switzerland stayed firm on its neutrality. But that's just to explain that during the Cold War, it was this idea of a kind of a black-white system where you are either with us or against us. And Israel was, in that sense, the advanced position of the West. Rightly because other countries were, as I said, enemies, not enemies, but let's say not very favorable to the West. But today we have a completely different situation. After the end of the Cold War, all these Middle Eastern countries have more or less established strong ties with the West for many reasons. Look at Saudi Arabia, we can even say Syria after what has changed, Egypt, Jordan, even Iraq to some extent. even if they are definitely not totally in favor of the US, but and of course the Emirate and all that. The whole context of the Middle East has changed. We don't understand this region. I think you know that the Iranians are not Arabs. But for a lot of people, this is the same thing. They don't make a difference between a Persian and an Arab. This is the Middle East. They are all Arabs. They are all Muslims, and period. This is as simple as that. And don't underestimate the stupidity of people. Don't underestimate the stupidity and the ignorance. I think this is a French prime minister who used to say that. Don't underestimating stupidity. Because a lot of people don't know. These people, they have never traveled, never been there, they don't understand. And we have to see that Iran has, especially in the modern part of Iran's history, Iran has always tried to get closer to the West. They have seen the West as a model somehow, and they always tried to get closer to the West. The problem is that just after World War II, we were still in this kind of colonial mentality, especially from the West. So nobody paid attention to that. And you had new forms of colonialism that developed and that extended over the whole Middle East. But one thing we shouldn't forget, Iran is something like more than 2,000 years old country, and probably more. And when I say 2,000, it's not like Israel, who is a mythical country. And even if the Israeli says 2000, we used to exist 2,000 years ago, that's written in the Bible, but nobody can certify this. And that's happened exactly the same thing with Iran this time. And we can see that with the time, although the Iranians have, in essence, used the same pattern as we have seen during True Promise 1 and 2. This is exactly the same pattern. The only difference is that during Promise 1 and 2, True Promise 1 and 2, we had the whole pattern of the Iranian response concentrated on one day. This time, this was diluted over 12 days, but it's exactly the same pattern. And it's fascinating to see that apparently the Israelis have not learned from the first two opportunities to learn. And it came out that apparently Netanyahu was surprised to see the response of the Iranians. And the Iranians, it was widely publicized, so it's not an invention of me. It was written. If you read Middle Eastern media, specialized media, specialized in geopolitics and military matters, you could say that the strategy of Iran was explicit. And it was the idea of dragging Israel into an attrition war. And apparently, the Israelis didn't anticipate that at all. And that's the reason why there is a point where Netanyahu had to call daddy, literally, to call daddy to help, because he was failing. And he could sense that what he started was a failure, because when designing the attack, they didn't anticipate this kind of response. And that shows this inability of the Israelis. And I would suggest that in that new context that has emerged since 30 years, Israel is no longer the only advanced position of the West. So it has lost its strategic value. The problem is that the Israelis have not realized this. And we see that because Trump, who is a pragmatic person, who tends to act tactically without a strategy, he reacts on opportunities. He's a businessman. It's the type of business you may find in New York. You jump from opportunity to opportunity. That's exactly what he does. There is no elaborated strategy and think like this is just opportunity and the next opportunity and all that. And in that context, he has established stronger ties with Saudi Arabia, for instance. Remember, recently, as he was there, he was promised an investment of 600 billion or whatever. And so we see that the importance of Israel, which is in fact almost, well, not exactly 100%, but it's largely supported by the US and other Western countries, that would probably not survive economically just based on its own capacities. Israel is a cost. There is no benefit beyond having a moral interest in supporting Israel. There's no real interest supporting Israel today. Even in Switzerland, where we decide on our own laws, you have opposition, and you have an opposition in Iran the same way. But beyond this kind of opposition, you have something that, because of history, and that's why I mentioned history before, because of history, you have a national pride. You have a sense of what nationality is. You have the sense of belonging to something which has not to be created out of nothing, but which is a reality since 2000 years. A reality, not a fantasy found on the Bible, a reality. And that's exactly what happened, is that people, because I mentioned before that even the Jewish minority protested against Israeli strikes against Iran. Because, again, despite the fact they be in another religion, by the way, I think in Iran you have the largest Jewish community outside of Israel in the Middle East. I think Israel had two main objectives, and a third one, which is also important, but probably not as important as two first ones. The two first objectives were A, to create a political crisis in Iran, and that obviously failed. And it failed because, and it's interesting because when you listen to, especially in France, for instance, where you don't have much real analysis on the conflict and probably little knowledge of the actors. But in any case, when you hear what you have on mainstream media, you have the feeling that the idea of attacking Iran would be followed almost immediately by a collapse of the government, because 80% or more of the population hates the regime, and therefore that if you decapitate, literally, from the Latin, to remove the head, if you remove the head of the government, that would allow the country to explode, literally. And it's interesting to see that this didn't happen at all. On the contrary, all the reports I've seen show that, in fact, you had, regardless of the political view and the individual view, or the view of individuals, you had a kind of strengthening of the national fabrics, if you want, of the country. Even you had a very strong condemnation coming from the Iranian Jewish community. And the leaders of the Jewish community in Iran condemned vehemently the salvage, they use the word savage attack of Israel. And in fact, a lot of scientists argue that it was not the reality. In any case, Israel disappeared and reappeared, and today it's just a pretext, period. Iran, on the contrary, was a country and has remained a country for so long time. It has reduced in size for a while, and the size, the Iran that we see today on the map is basically the Iran we had at the end of the 18th century. It has not changed.